and I'm here with Cecilia Bond in the Burkhart building at Ball State University, second floor. I think 219C is the office. And this is an interview that's part of the Ball State Vietnam Era Oral History Project. That's an immersive learning course we're doing this semester. Cecilia, I know that you grew up in Kansas. What was it, or at least you were born in Kansas. Did you grow up in Kansas?
No, I grew up, we moved to Colorado and then we moved to Missouri. Most of my life growing up was in southeast Missouri.
Southeast Missouri?
Yes.
Did you know a lot of military folks when you were growing up?
No, no.
What was life like in Missouri?
Well, it was rural, out away from town, and it was nice. We could go running around in the woods barefoot most of the summer, picking blackberries along the roads. It was a growing up time, a nice time, nice place to grow up.
What attracted you to the Navy?
Well, basically the uniform. My brother was in the Navy, and he came home on leave, and I was hunting around for some place to go. I wanted to leave the small town, and I didn't quite know what to do. I didn't realize or know much about student loans, so I thought I can't afford to go to college, and I had tried or interviewed for flight attendant jobs, and of course they were on competitive basis. You got selected to, they need 40 people. They took the top 40 people, and my brother came home on leave from the Navy, and he said, "Well, why don't you join the Navy?" And I said, "No, I can't deal with a lot of the superior people, the structure of that. I just told him I couldn't do it." But the more I thought about it, I went to the post office, and they had brochures for the armed services, and I took a few of them home and I looked at them. And the Navy had this nice brochure with this young lady who had all her uniforms, the summer uniforms and the winter uniforms, and the Army had. But it wasn't, I just, it was like a flip of the coin, but, just go with what made you feel good. So I sent in the postcard to the Navy recruiter, and they got me in right away.
What kind of things did your brothers say about the Navy? What encouraged you other than the uniforms? Did he have stories of seeing faraway places?
No, I don't think he said anything particular, because he was an engineman, and I knew that wasn't anything that I could do or was interested in. He was on a ship on the East Coast out of Little Creek, Virginia, and I think he had already had 4 years in the Navy, and it was just an impetus of just leaving, away out of town without having any funds to support me. I just had to go with some organization.
Did you feel at the time that was really the only way out of town, or were there other options for a young lady?
Was for someone without any money, yeah. Well, if you could find a job, but going to the big city, St. Louis or Memphis, would take some money, and I didn't have any.
Now, you enlisted, correct?
Yes, I did.
And can you tell me a little bit about going into the enlistment office, what that felt like, what was said to you?
Well, the Navy recruiter, his last name was Seaman, and he was pretty much interested, or he was going through the process, here are the forms, you fill out the forms and send them back to me. He did not work out of the small town we were in. He worked out of the the next larger town. It's another county, and so I can't remember if he called me or I met him. I can't remember that. I guess I did, but he I guess had sort of an interview kind of thing, and he gave me the forms, and he filled out some forms, and you have to be accepted, you know, apply for it, and let me know. Yeah, I did pass the qualifications and for entry, and wanted to know, well, did I want, he couldn't get me in the following week, but, you know, and I thought, well, you know, I thought a little more time would be appropriate, but he said, well, I can get you in the next month. I said, well, okay, and I didn't expect it to go that fast, but it did.
Now, just for the record, what year was that you enlisted?
And that was 1967.
At that time, the Vietnam War was going on. What kind of things did the community members that you spoke to, that you said, I'm joining the Navy, what kind of reactions did you get?
Oh, they didn't. The friends that I knew in high school, and they were, I guess, a little appalled. They thought that was, you know, far out, extreme, quote, beneath me, you know. They just thought it was really, it was negative. They didn't say that much, but I could tell they weren't that happy or enthusiastic or encouraging about it.
Was there a different reaction from older folks in your community versus the younger that you just described? Or?
Well, I didn't talk to many older people. It just went so fast, you know. Within 6 weeks, I was on my way to boot camp, and I had been working at the local factory, and they closed down in the winter time. They reduced the work force at that time, and you just would have to wait for them to call you back, and I just didn't want to sit around and wait to be called back.
What did you do at the local factory? What kind of factory was it?
It was a vinyl plastics, vinyl products company that we. My job was to stamp logos. You know, these are more or less advertising products, the little vinyl things, giveaway things, and things like that. Portfolios, and we had, you know, these big machines, and we had to set the type and the logo and anything that the customer wanted stamped on those products, and you know, a real hot, we called it chase, and we'd slide that in the machine, and then there was a ribbon of some, I guess, I don't know, it was a ribbon, a big spool of ribbon that had different colors, from gold to red to white to whatever the customer wanted, and you had to set that up, and you had to put the, like, wallets, little plastic wallets, or ID, put little things you put your ID cards and credit cards in a little folder kind of thing you put in your pocket, and we would push a button and the machine would come down and hit it and leave the image that the customer wanted on it.
And you wanted to get away from that?
Well, I worked at night, and it was, you know, a item thing. You know, you had to do so many an hour, and they had to be good. There couldn't be mistakes or inaccurate kind of thing. And for 8 hours of that, you know, I knew there wasn't a future in it.
What kind of news coverage? Do you remember what kind of news coverage you saw, or did you read the papers perhaps before joining the military? What kind of stories do you remember? What was being reported in Missouri?
Well, this was 1967. Local newspapers, you know, just about the town, things going on in the town. I don't remember much what was going on. Certainly the social things, like weddings and births and hospice, who's in a hospital, those kinds of things. It was rural. You know, you had farmers around. Court cases sometimes, if they had a court reporter. Then on Sundays we would get the paper from the St. Louis paper on Sundays, and that was real thick. And the comics were, I know, the comics were interesting, but you know, I read them all, and I don't remember much about it.
Do you specifically remember the tone of stories about Vietnam? We'll get to this later, but you later became a journalist in the Navy, and I'm just wondering if you picked up on sort of the tone of stories. Was it positive at that time? Was it negative? Were there student protests that were being covered? What was being said?
My memory isn't too, I don't remember, it didn't impact me that much, but the information about Vietnam was mostly on television. And then they didn't have, you know, the 24-hour news. It was 15 or 30 minutes in the evening, weekdays, and that's, you know, if you had a TV, that's what all you heard about. And that's the only information on the news that you got about Vietnam, was just that 30 or 15 minutes. I can't remember at the time. And the Huntley-Brinkley report was 15 minutes, and then I don't remember at what stage they moved to 30 minutes in the evening.
Okay, so now you've talked to the recruiter and you've signed the paperwork. What did they tell you would be doing, or what did you sign up for when you enlisted?
It's a matter of getting through basic training first, and after I think a couple of weeks, of course you had to take a battery of examinations, and then you were classified as far as from the scores that you got on the exams as to what you could do and what fields were open to you. And of course that depended upon the manpower level that they needed. If they needed a lot of, let's say, dental technicians or corpsmen, and you had all the right scores, they would offer that to you, or they would tell you, you know, here's a few other choices. And I believe what they offered to me was, well, journalism was one, and I think that was the only one that I thought that I would really like and really stick with. I think there were some other clerical positions or jobs, let's say, that were available to me.
Can we back up just a second? Can you take me through basic training? What was that like? Was that a good experience, a bad experience?
Traumatic. For me, it was traumatic. It was traumatic for a lot of young women. Homesickness, and we got off the bus and we caught the plane from St. Louis to Bainbridge, or I think it was Baltimore, Maryland, and we caught the bus to Havre de Grace, a little town outside of the recruit training center for women. It was called Bainbridge. Well, I don't remember the full title now, but it was the recruit training center for women. And from that moment on, you were just, you know, it was shouted orders, line up here, stand there. There was no nice greeting or anything. It was, you know, here are your things, get in line and go over here, follow this person. And of course it was a whole different world, a whole different life. And I didn't realize till several years ago that their method, or the reason they were so, they didn't ease us into it, was they wanted to see how much stress we could take. And it was emotional stress. Did
you ever think, I can't do this?
Oh, yeah, yeah. But I thought the alternative was to go back to Missouri. And I thought, well, I can't do that. So it was a matter of, just trying to do your best because it wasn't going to last forever.
What kind of physical tasks did they have you do that you remember that were extremely tough or that just memorable?
Well, marching. We had to march in formations to get, 60 women from one place to another on time, on schedule, and you always had, and you couldn't go one at a time. You had to go as a group, and there were always those who took their time, couldn't get organized, and of course, I think they relied upon the peer pressure to, get these people up to speed, let's say, and we didn't have to pass any physical examinations. We had to take swimming. We had to pass swimming tests, being in the Navy, anywhere from, they didn't care if we could just dog paddle, and, just get in the water in the pool and paddle, just get so far. They didn't care how you did it, if you did the backstroke or you're a terrific swimmer, or if you just had to paddle along just to get there. And then they trained us for, this is mostly shipboard duty, is if you had to, let's say, go overboard, and all you had was a pair of, well, what we call jeans, but they called them dungarees, and you had to tie knots, the legs shut in a knot, and then you had to throw them over the back of your head and put it over your back, and then swing it hard over your head and fill the legs with air and pull it shut real tight and pull it up under you and jump in. And there was enough air in the legs of the jeans to, quote, keep you afloat. And I can't remember if they had to be wet. I think they had to be wet because they wouldn't hold water if they were dry. That was about the most physical stressful thing that we had to go through. Today, I think women, their physical training is much more defined and hard. For us, it wasn't a matter of being physically fit, let's say. You had to have weight. There were weight standards.
So your basic training was different than men's? Were you aware of that at the time, the differences?
Well, I was hoping so, because I didn't know what the men had to go through. But of course, yes, women were different.
Was there contact between the sexes? Basic training. Did you see male recruits at all? Did you get to talk with them?
No. We had our own training command.
How about the outside world?
In the 6th week of our training, we got to go to, for a weekend, or it was just one day on a Saturday, we got to go to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and a bus would take us there, and we could go to restaurants, or we could go to movies or whatever. We just had to be back in time to get the bus back to the training center.
Did you make friends in basic?
Oh, yeah.
So what did you ladies do when you went to Lancaster, Pennsylvania?
Well, we were delighted to go to a restaurant and sit down and eat because in the training command you were, it was like, I want to say buffet style, but it was called a chow line, and you had the tin trays with compartments in it, and you just went by and you told the server on the other side of the line you wanted this or you wanted that, and I don't know, it didn't bother me, but some people thought it was a good break from the training.
How was the food?
Oh, it was good.
In basic, it was okay?
Sure, yes.
Now, you were segregated from men. Were there black women?
Yes.
Was there any conflict between whites and blacks this time? This was in the late 60s. Civil rights movement is still going. In fact, it's getting more militant. What kind of, was there any conflict there? Or?
No. We didn't have any conflict between the race at all. We were all just trying to get through it.
Do you feel like basic, the stress really bonded you?
Yes, in a way, because we we had to live in what we call the World War II Quonset barracks, and they were real wide wooden floors. They were real warm, though. You never got cold. And there were double bunks, and four on one side, and then lockers separating this one group from another four double bunks. So I had the bottom bunk, and the girl on the top had, of course, she had the top bunk. So we became friends. We were in alphabetical order by last name, and pretty much we, well, nicknamed. You would pick up nicknames, and we had one lady who was from Alabama, and she had a southern accent, so we called her Alabama. Mostly we would call each other by our last names. I was Smitty. And
that was your nickname?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, after basic training, where did you go from there? Was that first of all, was that a relief? How did you feel at the end of basic? I'd made it, you know?
Oh, yeah. Well, it got easier as time went on, because as time went on, people, some of, the recruits dropped out because of either academic failure or just emotional, being unable to adjust. A few physical sickness, or some injury or some illness showed up in whatever they, had, and it just, you just got used to it, and there was a little more humor and relaxation as far as conversation between the staff and us, and by the time you got to the end, you were very proud. There was a sense of pride.
Did you have, did you ever have a sense of how many people dropped out, or how many people didn't make it through basic out of your class? Like percentage-wise, was that fairly common not to make it through?
No, it wasn't that common, and I don't know percentage-wise. I think probably we started out with 60 in our company, and possibly, I think maybe 50 graduated. I could be wrong, because there are just so many, and they don't tell you, and you just don't have time. You don't think about counting. You say, oh, so-and-so's gone, and if you were falling behind academically, or in the stress tests that you had, emotional stress, if you couldn't follow the directions specifically, like you got a demerit for different transgressions. Let's say you didn't show up on time, or you didn't pass inspections. You had, your bunk inspections, your locker inspections frequently, and if you didn't pass so many of them, there was a cutoff that they would evaluate you and say, well, I think this person needs a little more time, and they would set you back a company, which is 2 more weeks back, and no one really wanted to be there longer than they had to, so it was devastating to be set back, and nobody wanted to do this. So there was motivation,
So when you finished basic, where were you assigned to?
I was assigned to Philadelphia, and a personnel office at the Naval Air Engineering Center.
What did you do in that job? What was your?
Well, I did a certain amount of typing. I did filing. Mostly clerical duties like that, and that was at the office at the barracks where we stayed. We had fire watches, which was somebody had to be on duty, 24 hours a day, and we rotated. Our duty days were every 4 days, and you had a 4-hour watch sometime during that day, and it was either early evening, close to midnight. It was a 4-hour watch, so you could get the midnight watch, or you can get the 4 a.m. watch.
Was this early 1968? Is that right? Or?
67.
It was 67 still.
Mm-hmm.
And once you were exposed to news again, and now you were a part of the armed forces, did you look at reports coming out of Vietnam differently? Was it still something that was kind of on the periphery that you didn't see? How would you characterize your exposure, your knowledge of the Vietnam conflict at this time?
Well, then again, the barracks where we lived, we had a lounge, a TV lounge, and with a group of people, you know, who gets to say what you watch. Well, you know, there were a group that people who watched a lot of TV. They liked cartoons and things like that. I didn't care for that. I think I used to get Newsweek magazine. You just didn't go get the newspaper every day, but you were aware of, as in Philadelphia, we were aware of the Vietnam soldiers. There was also a detachment, I guess that's the right word, of Marines who were stationed at the Philadelphia Naval Base, and the Philadelphia Naval Hospital was about maybe a mile or half a mile away from the base, and that was where a lot of the wounded Marines, I suspect Marines, yeah, maybe Army, but it was a naval hospital, so I suspect it was Navy and Marines who were wounded, came to recover and heal, and those Marines also who were assigned, they were assigned guard duty at the gates, and it was also right there at the naval shipyard. The naval base was, you know, pretty much adjacent to the naval shipyard, and so there was a certain amount of security going on there. And also the Marines had escort duty, they called it, when a Marine was killed in Vietnam. The tradition was that a Marine in dress uniform would escort the body to the funeral home. At the viewing or the funeral service, there would be a Marine in dress uniform there. And not a lot, but some of the women of Navy women who lived there or were stationed there would go over to, the Marines had a club, and that was the only club, if I recall correctly, that enlisted people could go to. And they would go over there, and of course they met the Marines and talked to the Marines, and the Marines would tell them stories. And it was heart-wrenching from what I understand. Of course, Marines tough. They don't cry about things like that. But there were, I guess, some very sad stories to tell.
Can you share some of the stories that you heard with us today? What kind of things were being said by the Marines?
Most of what I heard was, of course, this was third and second hand from someone else, that the families were distraught, and the Marines having to, you know, witness this, and what could they do? I don't know that any family members, you know, attacked them, because that happens. You know, sometimes they blame them, the person with the bad news kind of thing. But I don't have any specific stories, except it was hard for them to do, and there would be burnout. They couldn't send, there was just so many of these escort duties that they would send a Marine on after so many months. I guess it became psychologically hard for them, if you could say that, but I guess it was.
Were you at this time beginning to form any personal feelings toward American involvement in Vietnam?
I don't remember at that time that, because you didn't have the news, you didn't, 24-hour news, you just didn't go out and buy newspapers. Your only association was with the people that you ran into. The year, I was only there a year, so I never met anybody who came back from Vietnam, because this was a testing center. They tested the catapults that the Navy used on the aircraft carriers, and they would, just run a dead load down a catapult and see how many dead loads would it take before it broke. And of course, that's what our command was doing. So they had a lot of, most of the young men there were, just junior people, and probably not anyone who had been to Vietnam, so it wasn't that close. The only close thing that you could associate with Vietnam was, with Marines.
Was there a disconnect between you as a Navy service member and, for instance, the Army? Did you think of them as something different, or was it all one team? What was your mentality?
Well, they were different. Well, with women, because women didn't go to Vietnam. Enlisted women never went to Vietnam. It was the guys who went to Vietnam.
So the burden being removed from you ever having to even think about going, that you think that gave you the ability to kind of how did that affect your thoughts toward Vietnam? You just it made you not have to address it? Would you say that's a fair characterization, or how would you?
Well, you would have to be political, and we were, we joined the service, we volunteered, and you wouldn't be involved in what your government's policy was because you joined the service. And a lot of, I'm just talking with the women because that's what I remember at that time. We all had our motivations for joining the service, and a lot of us were just out of high school or a few years out of high school, out of jobs, and I don't know if there was a recession going on then or not, but it was a way of getting out on your own, and you didn't, that I recall, we didn't think of getting involved politically, or we just never heard about it. There were no political, there were no discussions. You couldn't. I'm thinking you couldn't be critical. Let's say, you because this would be wrong. I mean, if you were critical of because you swore to uphold the Constitution of the United States, and the President was your commander-in-chief, and it just was like disloyal to be chafing at anything that the President said or wanted. You just were there to support it because you swore that's what you would do. You would take your orders. That's what kind of thing it was. You took your orders. You were there and you volunteered.
What kind of things did you and other service members say or think about those who did criticize government policy, whether in the military or out of the military?
Oh, there were, there's always someone who's grousing about something, wouldn't take it seriously, but some people just have a smart remark or a critical remark, and they just make it in passing or sounding off. Just, that was, but no one ever took it seriously because it didn't go any further. And it mostly was complaining about your duty or the rules, the kind of thing that you lived with. Later on, I would say 1970, 1968, there were lots of student demonstrations, and that became a bit of a fearful thing because in 68, Martin Luther King was assassinated, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. There was great unrest, lots of student demonstrations, and in 1965, I think, if I don't have the date right, Watts, the I want to say riots, but there were lots of, around that time, racial riots, for a better word, I can't think of right now, maybe a better word, but that all became rather frightening. And it was combat a lot. There were shootings, there were fires, there was rock throwing, store windows were broken, just mayhem on the streets. And this was almost like a war, too. It was like being in war. You had to defend yourself. Well, you didn't have to defend yourself. You didn't go and participate in any of these things in the early part when I first joined the Navy. Later on, around 1969 and 70, a lot, because the draft was 1969. They had the draft lottery. They used the lottery to pick people for the draft, and of course there were lots of unwilling people who didn't want to go to war because it was an awful bloody thing going on in Vietnam, and many students, young people didn't want to go, and they burned their draft cards at a protest. And of course, it was a matter of, you're allowed to, as citizens, to voice your opinions and your thoughts to your government, to your country. It was democracy, But we weren't allowed to do that because we had sworn to not take orders, but to support the president and defend the Constitution. And if you weren't willing to do that, then why did you join? Of course, there were some people who didn't want to join the Army. They didn't want to go to Vietnam, so they joined the Navy. And there was not, hand-to-hand combat artillery in the Navy like there was in the Army, in the Marine Corps. So the Navy did benefit by lots of talented and well-educated people who joined the Navy so they wouldn't have to, go to Vietnam.
After being in Philadelphia, where was your next location? Where were you next?
Well, I was sent to Indianapolis to Defense Information School for journalism training, military journalism, and that was 3 months. And then I was assigned to the 5th Naval District headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia.
And now you're a journalist, is that correct?
Yeah.
And what did that job entail?
Well, that again, it was I was a lower-ranking person, but there was a lot of administrative duties, and one of the things I had to do was to go through all the local newspapers every morning. I had to go into work early and go through all the newspapers, and I had certain topics and subjects that our admiral was interested in, and I would cut these articles out of the paper and paste them to a piece of typing paper and form them up in a nice little packet for my boss, the public affairs officer, who then would brief the admiral on these are the things that happened locally, and he had different things he was interested in, and I had to search for all of these things, local and not anything national. I didn't have to, because that would be a whole newspaper sometimes, but it was just mostly the local things. I would write press releases for, we had lots of ships in Norfolk, and there was always, as a community relations thing, there was always a ship opened on the weekend for people to come visit, and I would call the people who had the open houses. I would ask them what ship it was, what hours, and where it was located, and I would do a small press release and get that out in the mail by Thursday, and answered the phone a lot. And of course the newspapers, the television, the radio, people would call if there was anything they needed answering about the Navy. And I would always you know, it was pretty much screening the calls and screening it to go to who, you know.
Were there any men who also did your job, or was this women's work, for lack of a better way
Oh
to put
no,
it?
there were guys who did that.
You are now, I'm guessing, a little more aware of, or a little more up to date with the news, having to read through the papers.
Yes.
And this was 1968, which you described as a very difficult year.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking back, what kind of thoughts do you have about 1968? We've got the Tet Offensive. What kind of things do you remember about early '68? What kind of stories were you reading?
Okay, early '68, I was still in Philadelphia. I didn't get to Norfolk till about July. I was still, you know, not in contact with the news media at all that much. The Tet Offensive, I didn't know what that meant until many years later when I was doing an interview for an article for our base newspaper, someone who had been injured in a Tet Offensive, and that's when I looked it up and saw that it was a major, a huge, lots of casualties, and it was. I don't know all the battles going on because there are many books written on the strategic movements of people and bombing and, you know, trying to keep the North Vietnamese from conquering the South Vietnamese, trying to get the South Vietnamese to protect their own country. We would help them, and lots of casualties, jungle things.
You mentioned some of the political figures and women not really being all that political, or at least you not being all that political early on. Were you beginning to find a political voice as you're reading the papers more once you are in Norfolk? Are you beginning to take sides on issues? For instance, the 1968 presidential election. Can you remember your thoughts at that time?
I remember when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. I was still in the Defense Information School in Indianapolis, and our class, you know, you rotate these duties, and we all had to, as a class, work the chow hall, the mess hall. We had to, you know, prepare the serving lines and do all the cleaning and then the washing the dishes, and some guys had to peel potatoes and those kinds of things. And they had on the intercom they had the radio on, and this was like we had to be on duty like 4 o'clock in the morning, getting breakfast ready, and they had the music and the radio, and then we heard that Robert Kennedy was assassinated in California. And I remember thinking, no, because John Kennedy had been assassinated. And you're thinking, not again, not again. And it was just almost a bit paralyzing, because you just wanted to absorb it and grieve. What could you do? But you had to get on with, you know, what needed to be done that day. And that was how we learned about, you know, John Kennedy being assassinated. Of course, that had nothing to do with the war. It was just, you know, someone who, you know, who Sirhan, who I don't know whether he was mentally unbalanced or what, I can't remember. But it was an individual thing.
Did you progress quickly up through the ranks? Did your job change over time in the late 60s, 68, 69? How did your job evolve?
Well, as soon as I was eligible, you had to have so much time in your present level, and then you had to we had an academic a test, a standardized test, Navy test, that's given twice a year, promotion exams, and you had to pass that, so you had to do a certain amount of studying. So when you were eligible time-wise to take the test, and then all those who passed the test, the Navy selected how many they needed for your particular specialty. If they needed everybody who took the test, everybody got promoted. But if they only needed about 10% of the people who were eligible passed the test at the time, and then they would take the top 10 people that had the highest scores, let's say. And yes, I just kept up with it. I just didn't stop, because I was always the next step you had to go, and it was just natural for me to keep at it.
Now, I've got that you were in Norfolk till 1970.
Yes,
is that correct?
Yes.
Did you come into contact with any Vietnam veterans while in Norfolk? Did you get to speak with any of them? And if so, what did they say?
I don't recall. If I'm going back to Philadelphia, I did have a boyfriend who had come back from Vietnam. He was a corpsman, and he had been wounded. It was very slight. They joked about it, unless you were really, really, wounded. Nobody wanted to know. It's a man thing that they don't want to feel sorry for themselves. But he was grazed across the arm with a bullet, and he got a Purple Heart for it. But I do remember him telling some stories. But he was a corpsman. He went out with the Marines, and he didn't say too much, about any specific stories or experiences he had. It was just, he was home now, and he was, I don't think he was going to make a career out of the Navy. He decided to, I guess, when he did his 4 years, get out. But that's the only one that I, heard. They just didn't seem to be political about it at all. It was just, we did it, and that was it. But in Norfolk, I don't remember meeting anyone that had any sort of experience or stories to tell. Maybe there were, but they just didn't talk about it,
After Norfolk, where were you stationed?
Seattle, Washington, 13th Naval District Headquarters in Seattle. And I pretty much, my assignments and duties were pretty much the same as they were in Norfolk.
Was public opinion about the war in Vietnam, did you notice it changing throughout those years, 68, 69, 70?
Well, when I was in Seattle, there were, of course, I want to say sailors who were involved with the war. They were anti-war protesters too. But and that did cause certain amount of well, I want not say consternation, but it became we've got this problem, kind of thing. As you wanted to fit in, but you also didn't want to be, because it was derogatory to be, you could be accosted and argued with if you, with some of your peers who were civilians, and many of the sailors, I think, on the ships who were, the Constellation was at the shipyard in Bremerton, which is across the Sound from Seattle, and there was a group of a certain amount of sailors there who were against the war, but dealing with that, I didn't have any personal knowledge of how the commanding officers and the chiefs and the officers dealt with that. It became sort of, we've got, the defensive thing. you didn't like the war either, but you didn't go out and protest it. You were afraid that, anyway, I was defensive about being in the military. You wanted to stay away from any of these protests. You didn't want to get involved in it because, you know, you would get involved if you did. You know, you might wind up in the brig. You would lose your career if you were thinking about a career. You could be punished, you know. There were lots of drugs involved with a lot of, well, that seemed to be things, student protests, and there was marijuana, there was drugs. And either thing you got, if you got mixed up in either thing, it was bad. Underground newspapers. I understand there were a lot of them, and this was, you know, if there were, if you found one or if you were involved with producing one, you know, which did happen, soldiers down in Fort Lewis, off base, you know, there were groups that had their underground newspapers, but I don't think they signed their names to any articles or anything. And I don't remember seeing one specifically, but I do remember seeing some sort of, it was like a flyer, and of course, you know, typewriters in those days, and it seemed to be a lot of black. There were drawings and you know, art, but it was all hand drawn, you know, and it wasn't slick or anything. It was you know, a kind of a handout, pass it out, and of course it was all off base. And I guess if I had found one, I would have, you know, as part of my job is searching through newspapers. I will, you know, would have said, hey, you know, this is, you know, what arrived on the doorstep, or I found this somewhere, something like that.
How much of a problem do you feel drugs were in the military?
Well, there was a problem. I didn't have any personal experience with it. I was naive. I just didn't know about. I didn't know anybody who was on drugs. But gradually, as time went on, we had training. As I, you know, progressed through my career, you become more responsible for people, and if you had someone that was, quote, hungover, or you know, was still I want to say hungover, but there's a better word, who had been on drugs, we were taught, you know, and you could, you know, hear other friends talking about, well, yeah, his eyes are all bloodshot. Well, I noticed he's wearing dark glasses all the time, so you can't see his bloodshot eyes. And there were a lot of relaxation of uniform regulations. Men were allowed to have facial hair and beards, sideburns. It wasn't like the short haircuts that, you know, they've gone back to now. And it was a matter of, I think, my own opinion was of the unrest of the anti-war people, that and hair was a big thing in that time, you know. Everybody, not everybody, but long hair was something, you know, that was the style. And of course, if you were in the military and you had short hair, and you didn't want to be picked out, oh, they're in the military, let's go argue with them about the war, or you know, throw some insults their way. You just wanted to be careful that you didn't look like you were in the military. I remember we didn't want to wear our uniforms, or we didn't have to, but you just didn't want to wear your uniforms outside the base.
Cecilia, we need to change the tape.
Sure.
Just 1 second. All right. We were talking about your time in Washington State. And specifically, you mentioned the USS Constellation. And off camera, we talked a little bit about race and how that played out in the military. Can you describe any racial tension that you felt in the military, and how that was similar or different to the racial tension in the United States at the time?
Well, there were, it's a crude expression, I guess, race riots. Since '65 in Watts, if I got the date right, that was always a big issue. And then there was lots of unsettlement, the anti-war protesters during that time. And I remember when Martin Luther King was assassinated, I was still in Philadelphia, and it came over on the news that evening. And we had at least two, it was a small women's contingent. I think maybe we had 15, 20 women living there in the barracks. And it came over on the news. And I remember one young lady we had said, "Good, about time," and it was something about maybe things will calm down now. Well, there was a black young lady there, and she was a very quiet, not very good, but she was rather sophisticated, if I could say that, and quiet. She didn't use rough language or anything, and she was just, to herself a lot. And she was very offended that this other woman, she was just in passing said, "Good, now maybe, he caused all the riots." That's what was her opinion, was all the race riots was because of Martin Luther King. And she just made some, rough comments and, just walking out in the hall. And the black girl heard it, and she was very offended. I don't remember, there were words said, but there were no violence going on. And of course there were lots of feelings and talking about who said this now, why would they say that? And it became, I don't recall, we were just appalled that somebody would say that because somebody was killed. And it was not, what are we anyway, kind of thing. And for somebody to say that was good, we were all offended. And the black girls, I think we had 2 or 3 black girls, black women in the barracks, and they took, a lot of offense at it. And there was, hard feelings, and of course people got transferred and stuff. I don't know if anybody moved out of the barracks or not because of that. But there was no violence in the barracks because of it. And speaking of the Constellation, when I was in Seattle, the Constellation was leaving the shipyard, leaving Bremerton, going to San Diego, and to save money, the dependents, the families, their cars and their household goods, they put them all on. Those who wanted to go that way could put all of this on the ship, and the ship would, transit to San Diego. And the captain of the ships invited, some Navy women. "You want to come too? Because we're going to have wives and children, and I think about 11 of us volunteered. Yeah, sure. We haven't been out to sea. And then there was words about some a protest going on, so they wanted us to because the Constellation was going to be leaving the shipyard the next day, that there was a planned anti-war protest going to go on in Bremerton. And so they told us, "We have to get you over here early in the afternoon, early like 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, to avoid any problems with getting, because we had to wear our uniforms, getting any of us involved in any violence or anything, because those who did were protesting. If you were in uniform, they would say something to you and try to engage you, and you just didn't want to be seen, involved with anti-war protests.
Were you ever engaged by anti-war protesters? Did they ever comment?
No, not personal. I mean, not personally, but that way. But I do recall a couple of conversations with other servicemen. We'd get to discussing the war. Are you for it? Are you against it? Just civilized conversation.
How was it aboard ship?
Well, it was boring. We didn't have a routine. There was, the eating, the sleeping routine. They tried to have some entertainment in the hangar bay for the families, and I think they had a band where you could dance, and of course, there were about 11 of us, and I don't know how many sailors, but they all wanted to dance with somebody, but it was all right. I think it took us about 2.5, 3 days, and there's no scenery. If you could get to where you could see out, there's just water. There's no trees. There's no traffic. There's no people. And if you don't have a particular job to do or something to keep you occupied, it got long, very long, and everybody was so happy to get to San Diego because the families that stationed there and the sailors getting back to their home port. They were really excited about getting closer to San Diego.
And just for the record, can you tell me what you know about the USS Constellation? What kind of ship it was? What missions it may have?
Well, it was an aircraft carrier, and it was leaving Bremerton to go to, they call it Yankee Station, which is the Western Pacific, would you say? The Western Pacific, to support, the aircraft, the fighter aircraft that were on the ship would, fly over Vietnam as far as reconnaissance, and I guess at some point they would be doing the bombing and the anti-war protesters. This was their major thing. This ship was going over there to do that, and they were going to voice their feelings about it. And of course, the ship has an engine, and it has people on it, and then all these things have to keep going to support the aircraft that came and went on the ship.
Was there a large protest when you left Bremerton?
Don't know. I didn't see anything,
Was
I understand there was in the small town of Bremerton, but we weren't cognizant of it. We didn't see it. We didn't witness it. We just heard that the intelligence or the people who are in charge of knowing what's happening said that there was one planned, and an anti-war protest was planned that evening.
How were the men aboard ship? Did you get to speak with them? What kind of things did they say about their missions or their lives?
No, there wasn't. I don't remember. They're just human beings. That we didn't engage in anything against the war or for the war. They're just, the regular lives and their jobs and their families, just the human things.
And after Washington, you moved on to Virginia again. Is that correct?
Yes.
Naval Training Detachment at Dam Neck, Virginia?
Yes.
Right, for another 2 years, 73 to 75?
Yes.
Can you tell me about that experience?
Well, that was a small Naval Education Training Command detachment. We were getting into, the Navy Command at that point, Education Command, wanted to get into using videotape for training purposes, and we were just a small detachment that had the equipment, and the videotape we had was on big, heavy reels, and it was like 2 inches wide. And the cameras were huge, big cameras, but we were pretty much studio bound, and it was just getting started. I was sent as to be a script writer for educational tapes, and we weren't, just never really got underway as far as a subject matter expert to design the scripts, design objectives, the teaching things that you would use in training someone. And the Navy, the Education Command decided to they had different priorities after a while, and we would close down, and that's when I was assigned to the NATO command in Naples, Italy.
Now, for someone who was in Missouri and wanted to get out of Missouri and see a little bit more of the world, was it very exciting when you were told that you were going to be sent to Naples? Or
I volunteered. The person who does the assigning, because I had come up for a transfer, because you're usually sent to a place for you rotated, so many years here, and then you had to rotate to a different type of duty, and we call him our detailer, who makes the assignments, said, well, I have a place in Naples, Italy that's opening up, and I forget what else he said. I said, I'll take it, because I wanted, I thought it would be interesting.
what was it like to be a U.S. service member in Europe in 1975?
Well, it was. I don't know that it was anything different than being a service member anywhere else, except, I was in a foreign country, and it was a NATO command, and it was a Southern Europe command of NATO, Allied Forces Southern Europe, and our staff was Italians, Greeks, Turkish. Italians, British, and Americans, and our staff was, had a mixture of all these people at different ranks and different services: Air Force, Army, Navy, and it was everybody who went there wanted to learn about its other culture. We had a certain amount of training before that. When you it's called cultural training. That's what it was. I don't know the exact name of it, but was to respect the culture, even though it's very different from yours and less than what you think things should be in America. As your experience in America, things are going to be different there. You won't know the language, the money is different, and you just have to respect it and learn it, and respect and learn all you can about the culture.
What were some of the biggest cultural differences? What culture shock did you encounter?
Well, the language, of course. When you can't communicate with someone, and it's a different language, the basic thing of being able to speak to someone who can understand you, quote, being on the same page, that's a good feeling if you just find it in your own language. But this struggle all the time of trying to be understood and ask questions, and you just have to go much slower. And of course, we lived out on, we didn't live in a barracks. We lived, rented an apartment from. I rented an apartment from an Italian lady, and she lived upstairs. I lived downstairs, and the electricity's different. We had to get these transformers that would step down the 220 volts, I believe, to the 120 that our refrigerators and washing machines, and you had to get all these things. And I was single, and I lived in apartments. I never had to buy a refrigerator or a washing machine and a stove and all those things. But that's the way apartments came, bare. And you just had to get these things yourself. And there was a network going that those who were leaving sold their things to those who came. And your car was different too, we understood there was a certain prejudice against Americans as far as, their big cars, and some people thought that they were superior to the Italians. And there was lots of poverty, too.
How were women treated in Italy? Any different than in the United States?
Oh, yes. Their culture is different.
How so?
Well, their women, not their women, but Italian women, let's say in Naples, they were intelligent, but there was a different thing about women in America at that time where wanting to be independent, and we didn't want to be subservient to men. We wanted careers that we had equal opportunity with the men. And my feeling, my observation there, the women there just assumed that's the way it was, with them. However, they didn't seem to be that independent or striving for a career. Their goal, let's say, was to have a family, and to have a relationship with someone. And of course, I didn't know many friends, Italian friends. Well, we couldn't speak the language, and I just didn't work with any of them at all and get to know them.
How were women treated in the U.S. military during your early time serving, and did that change later on? What kind of opportunities were available to you in the beginning?
Well, women pretty much were. There were just a few ratings that, traditional women things like clerical work, nurses, medical. They weren't going to be assigned to be enginemen, the tough, dirty, greasy, let's say, hard, physically hard jobs. But that was rather limiting, and especially the women officers, they knew they wouldn't get very far in a career, and this was one, women wanted a full career. Well, women officers knew they couldn't go to sea. We knew we couldn't go into combat. That was the law, and there were hearings in Congress, I think some years later, about this. And I believe, well, in 1978, there was a Women at Sea program, and I don't know if this was Admiral Zumont's program. No, I don't think it was Admiral Zumont. It was the Navy's program, Women at Sea. They would open more ratings to women. They could go to sea on ships in certain jobs, and there was always this thing, well, we would have to have women's bathrooms, and the ships aren't built like that. There would be morale problems because of men would, try to claim, one or two more women, and the jealousies and all of this. There were lots of reasons, and almost every psychological and sociological problem that could exist was brought up.
What did you think of those reasons? Were they valid reasons in your mind, or were they just sexist?
No, I thought it was patronizing. They wanted to, keep women as protected. No, you can't. You can't do that. And we just didn't. At that time, the women's liberation became a bad word. It created, a certain amount of animosity, because some people didn't like it because it meant women wanted to do masculine men things, and we weren't going to be patronized, or we weren't going to be told to, you can't do this and you can't do that. We can too, and you're not going to tell me I can't do this and I can't do that. We were just, I don't want to say belligerent, but we just decided we weren't going to take it anymore. And that was prevalent. Ms. Magazine came out in the early 70s. That was of course, I want to say a women's liberation thing, but just take uniforms, for instance. When I first got in the Navy, we wore, our suits, skirt and jacket, and you could not wear trousers, slacks, let's say, unless you were working with around a place that had to or was very cold, then you could wear your wool slacks, but you had to be told, well, this is the uniform of the day. You can wear slacks, especially like in Newport, Rhode Island in January, something like that. And it just became a thing of, well, you can't, we didn't say that, but it became a thing of, why can't we wear slacks? Dress suits, I want to say slack suits, were becoming the style. And I was even asked, I wore a nice slack suit, matching slacks and jacket, to a club late one afternoon with a friend, and I was asked to leave because I wasn't wearing a skirt. And this was in the 70s, 69, 70. And it was embarrassing, But and then, the civilian women that we worked with were allowed to wear slacks because the commander of the base, he didn't have a right to tell them there was no dress code. So, it became, why not us when everybody else can?
While in Europe, as a U.S. Service member, what kind of stories were you reading in the European newspapers about American involvement in Vietnam? Do you recall how?
Well, no, again, I don't. Well, the only newspapers. Well, yes, there was. We did get a newspaper out of London. We got some magazines out of London. The Italian newspaper, someone else, and the Greek newspapers, someone else. Searched those papers for articles that were relevant to the NATO command locally. We had the Associated Press teletype in the office, and part of my job was to watch the stories that came over. I had to come in early in the morning and go through the teletype from overnight, and it was kind of rip and read thing. We just we had a ruler that had a sharp edge, a steel edge on it, and we just lay it against the top at the beginning of the story and just rip off the parts, because stories would come through in pieces sometimes. It would just, I guess that's the way the teletype or the AP did things, they'd get a paragraph or two, and then they would interrupt it, and there would come another story. And so my job was to go through the overnight teletype and get the stories, but the news articles that my boss, the admiral, and all the generals on base would be interested in, and most of them were, AP is American, so the American generals and American admirals were interested in that. And if I may bring up this, when Saigon fell in 1975, I believe, when there was a flash story coming through, the teletype would go, ring a bell, and lots of times it was anything that we were interested in, but it did come through that the bell was ringing, and we'd just get up to look at it and see what it was, and it was Saigon had been, I'd say fallen, but the North Vietnamese had gotten into Saigon, overtaken Saigon. Of course, I think days before that, United States Americans were airlifting civilians and Americans out of the embassy, and then when this happened, it came across the teletype, and we quickly, just ripped it off and handed it off to my supervisor, who went running to the public affairs officer, who then just, went straight up to the admiral. And I thought, well, you just hear about the war in Vietnam all the time for years, and battles here and battles there, and it was just, that's the way life was. It was in the news all the time, and so I didn't realize, and I didn't keep real careful track of the Vietnam War, but it woke me up when they said this had to be serious, But I guess we had withdrawn, President Nixon had withdrawn the troops from Vietnam in 1973, I believe. The last troops left, and there were Marine Guards at the embassy until, I think it was 75, April 75, that the North Vietnamese had come into Saigon.
So you don't remember having any thoughts really about Saigon, any feelings about Saigon falling? Did you consider that a U.S. Loss, a failure, or did you not think of it that way?
Well, I had to regroup and think of what did that mean, because not being involved in combat, you didn't get the newspapers. There was no 24-hour news like CNN. You got it in the evening, and of course the Italian TV didn't understand the language, so there was just no television for me anyway to watch. It just was sort of out of touch with it, and I think after I thought about it a while, and what could we do? There was nothing that we could do. We didn't, as a NATO command, I guess may have been some security raised. I'm not sure what all that was about, because I wasn't involved in any intelligence or anything like that. It was like, well, it's over. Does it mean it's over now? So, that's pretty much, I guess, it was over.
So the people that you talked to, would you say that relief was something that was felt by all, that it's over? What kind of things were other people saying that you came in contact with on the NATO base?
I think it was just remembering back on the Americans that were with us. It was, and I think it was sort of an alertness. Now it's going to happen. And the next day, nothing happened, and our government had pretty much accepted that's what was happening, but I don't recall any of the details of what happened after that. I just, the newspapers were not available to read that well. You didn't have time to read either the opinion papers, because you didn't have a subscription. You couldn't take the paper home. It came to the office like, a week later.
Do you happen to remember what was the big news story in Italy in April of '75 when Saigon falls?
I don't know, because I didn't know the Italian. I couldn't read the Italian newspapers. The Italian TV was just still black and white. There was no. Well, I know of that we had color, and I had no TV. So I didn't watch any of it. I just wasn't available.
I guess what I mean was what was going on at your base in April 1975 that was more immediate, that affected you more. What was going on in 1975 in Italy? Any recollection of that?
Well, it was a NATO command, and NATO had its, mission. There were exercises, with other countries, how they could all work together, and the plans for, what an exercise is, you get planes and ships and troops together, and you go through the motions, and there's a scenario that's written up, and how do you react? How would you react? What would your plans be? Because that was much higher levels than myself, and I do recall having to. There was one, and a lot of it was with Russia. Russia was the enemy. The Soviet Union was the enemy, and that's all what NATO was about, was defending Europe against Russia. And so all the scenarios, as much as I could know about, was the enemy, the Soviet Union, invading Germany or something like that. These were all exercises. And it was, just pretty much out of touch with the world because there was not that much media news going on. It's a different language. Couldn't understand it.
Would you say that during the entire Vietnam conflict, in America, the public was more concerned with the Soviet Union than they ever were with the North Vietnamese? Would you say that's a fair characterization, or how would you characterize the Cold War?
Well, if I recall correctly, the Vietnamese War was about the domino theory. You know, if Vietnam fell, that would be communism, and then the countries in Southeast Asia would all go communist, and then that was something that you know the Cold War was about in the United States. And Europe was defense against the Soviet Union.
Did you fear communism when you were younger?
Well, I knew it was bad. Yeah, it was an unknown. We did know that Stalin, Hitler, of course, was not Russian, but we did know that that was an awful life to have. There was no democracy.
You served until 1988, is that right?
That's correct.
What kind of changes did you see in the military because of the Vietnam War, if any? Did you see America react in any way to the experience in Vietnam in terms of military training, objectives? What was learned from Vietnam, do you think?
Well, there was concern with the military, the number of ships and planes and tanks and the number of personnel in all the armed forces. How do you keep this in balance? Ships get old and rusty. They need to be refurbished, and thinking about defense as more technology became available changed. And there was the small amount that I knew or paid attention to was in Congress wouldn't fund a certain type of new ships. The Navy wanted new ships, the Army wanted tanks, and there was criticism about, well, you're thinking, the service is thinking World War II. That's not the way it is. Take a look at Vietnam. You couldn't do anything with tanks there very much. It was jungle warfare. So it was a matter of different tactics on we have to change. And I got the impression, or Congress, thank God, they were watching the bottom line. And as the American taxpayer was thinking, we have to pay for this too, that the admirals and generals were wanting equipment that maybe we don't need it anymore. And then it was a matter of convincing the services to change. And I guess there needed to be free-thinking people at the top to say, we're going to have, we got to do this differently. One thing being the Trident submarine. I was stationed at the submarine base in Bangor, Washington, which is, across the sound from Seattle. Beautiful new base that was built. I was considered a plank owner. It was just commissioned, and they hadn't gotten all the buildings there. All the commands that would support the Trident submarine. And the Hood Canal is a very deep canal that goes up just east of the Olympic Mountains. And I understand it was like 100 fathoms deep at points. So it was very, very deep canal and nice for submarines. And when I got there in 1977, we were expecting the first Trident submarine, which was supposed to be the biggest submarine that the Navy had, knew that we were expecting it. It was the USS Ohio. It was supposed to be there, I got there in 77. I think it was supposed to be there by 1980 or sooner than that year, the next year. I was transferred in 1982, and it still wasn't there. We still didn't have the first Trident submarine there. So, things, budgets, changing, thinking about, I'm not a strategist or anything. This was never, anything that I had anything to do with. I just, reading and hearing conversations and discussions people would get into. The news, people, on the news. Well, we did start getting more news on TV, watching television more. Discussions in Congress, these were things more available.
You seemed to be fairly apolitical when you were younger. Do you keep a closer eye on politics now? For instance, what do you think about U.S. involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan? Do you have any thoughts on that? Is that comparable to Vietnam in your eyes?
No, then I was pretty much was very conservative, going along with my responsibility. Then my responsibility was not to protest, or why was I there if I didn't like what I was was there for? And now I'm Iraq, Iran. Yeah, I've got all kinds of opinions about that.
Were those shaped in any way by the U.S. experience in Vietnam as you've come to understand it?
I think so, yes.
How so?
Well, Iraq, as we've learned that, why did we go there? We toppled a dictator, but then the human thing about people who've been repressed and then they've given so much freedom, they don't know what to do. I don't think they know what to do, but those that just want to go wild, let's say. Oh gosh, I'm using the bad word. When people get too much freedom, like a child in a candy store, it's just do anything. And then, of course, it may be a human thing of so much repression that you just, explode with it. Insurgency. It's you don't have a line, a boundary that you're defending. It could be the next door neighbor who's working with others to put a car bomb, down the street. You don't know the servicemen there now. It's a whole different way. You don't know. What are we fighting anyway? We're fighting, the guy down the street. Now, with all our tanks and bombs and sophisticated equipment and satellites and unmanned drones that can explode and drop bombs, and we've got our servicemen who have very sophisticated equipment, guns and scopes and all of that. The average person, it seems, who has none of all this sophistication and armament can do more damage than we can with all our equipment. And it's like they say, it's a different war. You're fighting a different war. But then again, is it a war for what? And I think the mistakes of our officials, government officials, may have been personal, but what were they thinking? And like Afghanistan, we've got certain generals now. Well, they want to protect the people because the people are the ones who it's their country, and they're going to have to live with it. Now, what are we defending them against? They hate us, and especially if we're bombing and they're killing their families and relatives. You can't. They don't trust us, And I think it would take another few generations before that problem is solved, let's say. And why do we want to solve it, except that, remotely we're connected, our country will be. We were attacked in 9/11, September 11th of 2001. No one else was, but we were. So you have to, push back. Otherwise, you're going to be taken advantage of. And in my experience with being in Italy and the Mediterranean culture, anybody there, no matter how poor or how uneducated or how educated they are, they want respect. Everything is the bottom line is respect. I need, the man who sold us our kerosene to keep our little kerosene heaters going in the summertime, in the wintertime. Certainly he wasn't, a very educated and powerful a man, but he wanted respect.
At the time, it sounds like you didn't think about Vietnam all that much. Now that that you've had a little time to reflect on it, you've probably seen movies, news stories, read books.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about U.S. involvement in Vietnam? Do you think it was the right thing to do to stop communism, stop the domino theory, or do you feel that was not a valid reason for U.S. involvement?
Well, I've pretty much digested the whole situation. As the trouble spots in the world are divided countries. Vietnam was divided. Korea is divided, north-south. This is where, the wars are going on. Is the North Korea, South Korea, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, the Palestinians and the Israelis. Those are three spots in the world that there's always conflict going on. And I feel I might just overall would think, if the countries are united, there will be peace.
Concerning your service in the Navy during the Vietnam era, I'm out of questions, but I'd like to give you this opportunity. Anything I might have missed or didn't touch on concerning your service that you'd like to say, now's your time.
About what now?
About Vietnam, about your service, your experiences, turbulent 60s, early 70s. Just anything that I haven't touched on in this interview that you thought I should, or you think I should?
Well, I guess I wasn't very expressive about how my consciousness or method or just psychological being during those years from 68 to the early 70s during the Vietnam War, that it was a fearful time for me. It was a time of being defensive about where I was, what I was doing, not. I guess the thing that was I didn't want to be known as being in the service because I wasn't like my peers who weren't in the service. I resented having to be defensive about it. It was a matter of, biting your tongue and just not saying anything, but then not really having a strong conviction about, am I right or am I wrong? And I guess a certain amount of conservatism, politically, the Nixon, the Johnson administration, the Nixon administration, the Vietnam War, the casualties, 58,000 plus casualties, men have come more, and that's my generation. What would our country be like if these men had not died? But then I think of all during that period, it was such a wonderful time because we broke loose from the 50s conservatism. I just have to smile nowadays when I think of all the people, all my peers that went to college, and you didn't have to have good clothes. You could wear old jeans. You could, long straight hair was nice. Was flowers in your hair, and the folk music at that time was to me it was thoughtful. It was something you could sing. I don't know that I could sing anything that's on the radio today, but in a way, it was lots of freedom, an awakening to freedom and liberty, and being yourself, and having the prospect of having a career of your own, and medically, there was just lots of freedom. But then, the sadness of all the men who died. I never had anyone in my family die. I did have a brother who was in the Navy, of course, and he was on one of those gunboats that I understand they were based in Guam, but then they would go over, they would take a turn over in the Mekong Delta and guard, or they had guns on the ship, and that was a certain amount. But he didn't go into what they call a brown water navy, that go up into the Delta and the rivers. That was very dangerous because they were always ambushed. It was a high ambush and lots of casualties. And I had a brother in Air Force, and he was stationed in one of the large Air Force bases in Vietnam, and his job was corrosion control. He had to, I guess it was the B-52s, I'm not sure what planes he had to, but he had to wash them down and put not chemicals, but so lubricants or something on the plane shells, so any rust or corrosion in it. He had to do all of that, and he liked it because he was pretty much independent. He liked it, but I suspect there was some Agent Orange he had gotten in contact with in doing that. Today he has a lot of bone deterioration. And then I had a brother in the Army, and we were all in the service at the same time. But he was stationed he's had 2 or 3 tours in Korea and Europe, so he didn't go to Vietnam.
Well, Cecilia, thank you very much for your willingness to participate.
Well, you're welcome.
Thank you for your service.
Well, you're welcome. I enjoyed it.